I also wanted to mention that there is a support donation button on the left-hand side of the whatonearthishappening.com website. If you feel you've gained value from the information I have shared throughout the course of this radio show, feel free to make a voluntary donation by clicking that button on the left-hand side of the website. So I want to direct everyone's attention to the whatonearthishappening.com radio show page, where, as always, during the live broadcasts, I put underneath the player on the radio show page, that's the radio show tab of the website, images for tonight's show. They are listed as numerical links, and if you click on them, it brings up a small slideshow that you could follow along with the slides that I've prepared for the concepts and ideas I'll be discussing on tonight's show. So the main topic for tonight is going to be, how does Scientism see the process of evolutionary development versus how have many different mystery traditions and mystery schools over time seen this same process, and how do these things compare and how do they contrast? How are they alike, and how are these concepts, as discussed by these two schools of thought, drastically different from each other? So on the radio show page and with the podcast, and again, this will be podcast number 152, image number 1 was simply the poster, the flyer for my Streetwise Spirituality lecture in seminar in St. Louis. That's there. You could feel free to share that on any website or social media, or print it up for whoever you might know who might be able to attend. Image number 2 is this very simple chart that I have built regarding two forces that are at work in our lives at all times and places. These are the two forces that are essentially at work in the universe, all around us at all times. One is the force that moves us forward. One is the force that holds us back. We'll pick that up on the other side of the break. We'll be right back. The topic for tonight's show is how the ancient mystery schools saw the force of evolution, and how their worldview regarding this force was different than the way Scientism sees the evolutionary force at work in the world, specifically through the theories of Charles Darwin, and how that's been applied in our modern world, particularly through what is known as social Darwinism. So, slide number 2, I made a very simple chart, or just a graph of these two forces and what they involve. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that in the green coloring, I've put the force of evolution there and directed arrows moving from left to right, the same direction that we, write text in here in the Western world. And, that's supposed to represent that it's moving forward. It's moving from something that is lesser to something that is greater. It's moving from some place that is less advanced to a place that's more advanced, and it's moving in a forward progression. So that's really what evolution is all about. It's about forward movement. The word itself comes from the term to unfurl or to unfold. To roll out is literally what the word means. It means to roll out. Okay? So evolution is an expansive force in creation. And, just as a brief aside, I just want to say I'm covering this topic because it seems that the universe wants me to really talk about this because of synchronicities that have happened to me in my life over the past several weeks. Everything keeps coming back to people's view of what real evolution is in my life when I'm speaking to people. And it seems that one of the major things that is holding back people's worldview in life and holding them in a state of mind control and unconsciousness is their completely erroneous notion of what evolution is based on their religious acceptance of the Darwinian theory of evolution proposed and propagated by Scientism. And when you see how rigid how absolutely rigidly they are attached to this belief system. And it is only a belief system because it is only a theory and has never been 100% factually proven scientifically. As I said last week on the show, macrobiological Darwinian theory has never been borne out in the fossil record. It is still only a theoretical approach to how biological organisms propagate themselves into the future and preserve their genes and advance their genes. And while I would say that I tend to agree with some of the concepts contained in Darwinistic theory, like adaptation, natural selection, things like that, I don't subscribe to macrobiological Darwinian evolutionary theory that propagates the notion that a species becomes a completely different species, and then there's a bunch of transitional fossil species in the fossil record. The reason I don't subscribe to that is because the main thing that would espouse and support that theory would be evidence in the fossil record. There would be many transitional species found in the fossil record for all kinds of species, and the evidence just doesn't support that claim, especially for human beings, most of all for human beings. There is not one bone in the so-called hominid ancestors of humanity that is present in any human skeleton that has ever been uncovered on the face of the earth. Okay? So there's many more reasons why I feel it doesn't hold as much water as people think that it does and put as much faith in it as other people do, which we will get into in the future. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because the topics that I'm going to go into in the future on this show, coming in future weeks, are going to be very dependent on a view of evolution. It is going to be about what is better, what is worse, what really propagates progress, what really holds back progress. These are really the forces that we're talking about as have been taught by, again, ancient philosophical traditions, ancient wisdom traditions. What we really have to see these two forces on this slide as, evolution and involution, I'm speaking of, are the one force that helps us to move forward, and then the other force is simply what holds us back and is working against our unfolding, okay, and against our expanding. All right, it's that which shuts us down, this involutionary force. So let's look at some of the differences between these two forces and how they work against each other. The evolutionary force, again, is the force of forward progression and creation within the universe. It is that which is moving things according to the will of creation. Okay? It is moving things in an orderly progression forward, in betterment, in greater levels of order and complexity. Conversely, the involutionary force is that which is working to create stagnation. It is a degenerating force. It breaks things down. It doesn't order things, it breaks them down, okay? And it separates and it divides. The evolutionary force is syntropic. Now, many people will never have heard that term. It is the opposite of entropy. Syntropy is what scientists have postulated as meaning the ordering force in creation. It is that which is the opposite of entropy. Some scientists refer to this as negative entropy because they didn't have a real opposite for entropy. And entropy, again, is the chaotic force, or the force that creates disorder in a system or breaks things down. And we see that. You just leave something to the default conditions and how it is already, and things become more and more disorderly. I mean, you don't do anything within a house, within a living space for months or years. It becomes absolutely, there is just total breakdown of order. Things become dirty. Things become dusty. Things become chaotic, disordered. Eventually, all matter works toward that tendency, the tendency to break down, the entropic tendency. Entropy is always at work in the universe. It is a force that is 100% continuously operating through time. And as time moves forward, entropy keeps, exerting itself and breaking things down further. But there is this other force that is actually counterbalancing entropy. It's called syntropy. So that's the evolutionary force. It is the syntropic force within creation. That means that it is the ordering force. It is the thing that creates higher levels of order. And it does this through will. Again, this is how the occult schools see these two forces. It isn't just something that just magically happens. It occurs through the will of intelligence that exists within the universe. It's not something that is working like clockwork. The involutionary force is something that just works like clockwork. Okay? That works without an intelligent organizing principle behind it. It's just there by its nature. Okay? That works against this evolutionary force to provide some pressure or some kind of feedback or something to just give it something to push against. Okay? So, and again, that's that law of compensation and that law of rhythm that we've talked about when we went over, the principles that underlie natural law. So we'll pick this breakdown up on the other side of the break. Stay with us, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about the difference between the two universal forces that are really always at work in our lives, as discussed and propagated by ancient wisdom traditions throughout human history. They were referred to in occult schools as the force of evolution versus the force of involution. Again, involution is a term not many people may have heard about or seen unless they have looked into occult schools of philosophy. But we were discussing what evolution does, and it is the ordering force within creation because it is driven by intelligence, it is driven by holistic intelligence, it is driven by will, and it is something that creates greater levels of complexity and diversity. Conversely, involution is the stagnation force. It is the force which wants to hold back or thwart forward movement, forward progress, creation, and it wants to degenerate things. Now, degeneration, right in the word, you have the word generare. Okay, that comes from the Latin verb generare, which means to make or to create. So to degenerate means to do the opposite of to create. It's to destroy or to break down. As such, involution is the entropic force, the force that goes against ordering. It creates chaos and it creates disorder within any given system. It is always looking to create less complexity by breaking things down into their more simple constituent forms and until there is absolute uniformity within the system. And this is where I would say science agrees. These points that we've made so far, modern science would agree that that's what these two forces basically do. If you even want, they wouldn't call it involution; they would simply refer to it as entropy. But up to this point, we have agreement between the worlds of spirituality or occult schools of thought, if you will, and modern day science. Now, where I'm going to get into a big dichotomy that the whole notion of Darwinistic evolutionary theory completely leaves out is in these next three categories. And then we'll conclude this chart by looking at, what is the end goal, what is the end result. So I would say that, and again, as taught by, a myriad of mystery tradition schools of thought, evolution actually contains within it the advancement of consciousness. It is always creating more consciousness because it is creating more complexity and order. That's what consciousness is all about. Okay, consciousness is the ability to recognize something that is taking place, the ability to become aware, the ability to see patterns of what's taking place, not only within oneself, but in the environment in which the self is operating. Okay, and then as a result of that consciousness, you have the ability to then use the will to create more order and create more complex forms and more diversity, and the process continues to unfold. And again, that's ultimately what is completely left out of the Darwinistic notion of evolution, because it leaves out free will. It leaves consciousness at the door. Okay? Consciousness doesn't even enter into the equation when it comes to people thinking about this from a scientism perspective. Okay? It's just about matter and genes propagating. Okay? Like clockwork, like this Newtonian worldview, clockwork mechanistic view of reality, of nature, of science. Okay? Consciousness doesn't play a role in that. So this is where it completely diverges from the scientific definition of evolution. Okay? And as a result of more consciousness, when you are able to see patterns, when you're able to recognize the differences between things, and then choose by will that which is going to advance you forward, okay, that which is going to create more order, more complexity, more diversity, more advancement of consciousness, what you are going to then understand more about and then choose between and then develop more of is moral behavior. So there is more morality as the evolutionary force progresses, or in other words, as we are becoming more and more evolved, that by definition means that we are becoming more and more moral as a people. So without true morality, without consciousness and morality, I would say, and all of the ancient traditions that attempted to teach wisdom to human beings taught and concurred that that force of evolution would have to contain within it morality and consciousness, or it wasn't evolution at all. It was nothing of the kind. It was exactly the opposite. It was involution, it was stagnation, and it was degeneration. So again, this is where Darwin and the theories and the people who have adopted his theories and have propped up his theories as religious dogma will never touch, will never go near. And you hear people kicking around the term evolution, and they're really not understanding what true evolution is all about. What they're doing is they're ascribing the Darwinian worldview of evolution to the actual force that is at work in nature. And by leaving morality out of the equation, they think that just if something physically survives and propagates its genes, that means that it's evolving. That is not what real evolution is. Okay? Or if you want to call it simply evolution as taught by ancient wisdom traditions, that is not how they saw, nor is it how I see the evolutionary force at work in our lives at all whatsoever. So when we have these qualities and we're developing them, and they're coming from more order, they're coming from more complexity, they're coming from forward progress in creation, that being consciousness and morality, the result that goes to work in our lives as a species that has the capacity for holistic intelligence, what we receive as a result of that is more freedom. Now, what will more freedom produce in our lives? It will, again, play right back into that system like a feedback loop. We have more freedom. We have more ability to create more order. There's more. We're going to be able to create new things. There's going to be more complexity and diversity in the culture amongst the species. Therefore, consciousness, the ability to recognize patterns and meaning with respect to those patterns, is going to increase. And as such, we're going to be able to more clearly see the difference between right and wrong, and then choose the right over the wrong, and increase morality, and then keep increasing freedom as a result. You could see this is a snowballing effect, or it is a feedback loop that feeds back into itself. Okay? Conversely, the force of involution does exactly the opposite. It is always breaking consciousness down through fear, because that's what it does. It breaks things down. It is the entropic force, which ultimately creates nothing but chaos, and it creates less complexity, okay? And it breaks things down into their constituent elements, okay? And when we're applying this in the sense of consciousness, what that means is it's always instilling greater amounts of fear. So therefore, there is less consciousness. There is less ability to recognize patterns and meaning. And therefore, people are not going to be able to distinguish things because they're not going to be really thinking clearly. Okay? And again, these things that I've put in brackets here, okay, to make this very clear, these are the forces, once again, or the qualities, I should say, regarding these two forces that are left out by scientism, by the Darwinian view of evolution and or involution and or entropy, if you want to call involution entropy. And these apply to beings with the capacity for holistic intelligence. I want to make that absolutely abundantly clear. Should have put that on the slide, but again, I just wanted to make this a simple chart without, too much clutter. Okay? The things that are in the brackets apply to intelligent beings. They don't apply to the beings with less complexity and more uniformity. That's why they don't apply to single-celled organisms. Okay? Single-celled organisms' goal is to evolve eventually into a point where they develop more complexity, more diversity, and evolve to larger beings. Okay? Therefore, they would have the capacity for more consciousness. See, that's where we cross the line between biological evolutionary progression, okay, these four that are not bracketed at the top of the list, these four qualities that are not bracketed, into the realm of true holistic intelligence, or again, you don't want to say it's definitely holistic intelligence, but it is the capacity for holistic intelligence, because I wouldn't apply that term to humanity. Humanity is not a holistically intelligent species, not yet. Where some of us are trying to work our way toward that end goal, to become a truly holistically intelligent being, okay, and then propagate that to all other beings in our society and make it a truly holistically intelligent society. But that's not what we are right now by any stretch of anybody's imagination. If you think that, I think you're an extraordinarily naive human being. Okay, we have the capacity, though, for that holistic intelligence. We're talking about evolution versus involution. These ancient, these universal, competing forces that the mystery schools of the ancient world broke down and helped to try to help humanity to understand that these forces were always at work in our lives, and that they governed the free will decisions regarding how we choose to behave and what we get as a result. Okay? When we think about evolution in scientism terms, in Darwinistic terms, it leaves consciousness at the door. It doesn't even consider morality as having to do with evolutionary progression of a species like us that is gifted with the capacity for holistic intelligence. It looks at things in a clockwise, mechanistic, mechanical, robotic, dead, lifeless sense, which is an ancient, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't mean ancient meaning like, spanning aeons of time back. I mean as outdated, fossilized, and completely no longer viable view of a scientific paradigm. This is a Newtonian paradigm that has long since been really completely disproven and blown out of the water by modern scientific thought. The problem is that these new modalities of science really don't reach the public's eyes and ears. Certainly not with any level of intensity or level of import, that they need to be reaching people. So when a new science emerges in the modern world, it usually takes somewhere between 15 and 20 years for people in the public to even really hear about its findings. And that gap is now widening. It's not shortening. As science, moves forward and progresses and starts to learn new things about how the world really operates, more and more people are trapped in old worldviews and old notions that have long since been disproven. And, that gap is now probably closer to 25, 30, maybe even 40 years. Amazingly, even in the information era. So, to go back to this chart that we were breaking down, this is image number 2 on the whatonearthishappening.com radio show page or with the podcast. The three fields here that we're looking at that completely diverge when it comes to seeing evolution in the occult sense versus seeing evolution in the modern day scientism sense is consciousness, morality, and freedom. Does the evolutionary force have to do with these qualities of human beings, of human behavior? And I would suggest that they absolutely have to do with those qualities. 100%, definitely. The more consciousness, the more morality, the more freedom, the more we are moving forward. That's what it means to evolve and progress. Okay? And that's what advances human beings' survival, or the survival of intelligent species, or again, species with the capacity for true intelligence. Okay? So, the involutionary force, conversely, when there is less consciousness, that is, unconsciousness at work, not being able to see the patterns, being rooted in fear, and then not being able to really tell the difference between things, to distinguish, to discern, okay, which is what real higher order thinking is about. It is about discernment and being able to make a delineation between things that are truly different from each other. And we need to do that when it comes to behavior, when it comes to right versus wrong behavior, which we've talked about endlessly here on this show. When we do that, there will be more freedom if we choose the right over the wrong. Conversely, if we are allowing involution to take its course and we're not evolving our consciousness, we are not progressing in morality, that will result in less freedom. Okay, this is the law of freedom at work through natural law. As morality increases, freedom increases, and as morality declines, freedom declines. Ultimately, and where this branches back into, I guess you could call it an agreement of scientism, is that the evolutionary force is what advances survival, and the involutionary force, or the entropic force, is what advances extinction or prevents survival. But what I want to bring up here is just survival, the ultimate goal of evolution. See, is physical survival the ultimate goal of evolution? I agree that survival is one of the goals of evolution, but it is survival in a more advanced form, okay? Not just biological survival in completely entropic and disorderly and chaotic and conditions that promote more and more suffering. And really, if you're just biologically surviving in conditions like that, is that true evolution? Is that true progress? Is that forward progress? I would certainly state no, it is not forward progress. It is anything but. So when you get rooted in the whole, it's nothing about propagating genes thing, okay, which is what I am hearing more and more about what people think evolution is. It's only about propagating our genes. It's only about propagating DNA. It's about natural selection so that the genes can be propagated into the future, in the future time. Well, that's not necessarily what evolution really means, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't just mean biological survival. Something can be biologically surviving and degenerating simultaneously. The true meaning of evolution is forward progress. You are progressing from the simple to the complex. You are progressing from the uniform to the diverse. You are progressing from less consciousness to more consciousness. You are progressing from less morality to more morality. You are progressing from less understanding to more understanding. You're progressing from animalistic behavior to truly civilized human behavior. You're progressing from less freedom to more freedom. You're progressing from less willpower to more willpower. And I could go on and on. There is a distinguishment. There is a delineation. There is one thing that is not as good and one thing that is better. It is about forward progress from the bad to the good, literally. And there's so many people who are trapped in this Darwinistic worldview when it comes to what this force means, that it only means the propagation of biological material. Anything can do that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's more evolved. Just because it's survived doesn't mean it's evolved. Once again, can't you imagine the condition where something survives and degenerates or stagnates, even though it's continuing to survive? What's the point of survival if you're not really making forward progress in consciousness? If you're not making forward progress in morality? I would certainly say you're not truly evolving then if that's the case. And this is how the ancient wisdom schools taught evolution to their acolytes and adherents. They were trying to explain there's biological evolution, that's at work, but only up to a point. Then when something develops the capacity for true intelligence and being able to choose and developing true free will, you're not just a creature of biological instinct. You're more than that. You've developed the capacity for holistic thought, both logical thought, reasoned thought, mathematical and scientific thought, as well as intuitive thought, creative thought, compassionate thought, nurturing thoughts. Okay? They're both of these forms come together to create intelligence. That's why people in the modern world and in scientism, unfortunately, only equate mostly intelligence with intellect in the modern day. They have intelligence quotient, and it's all about verbal and math skills. Well, where's the compassion? Where's the creativity? That has nothing to do with holistic intelligence. That's intellect quotient. An IQ test. That's what it should be called. It shouldn't be called an intelligence quotient. It should be called an intellect quotient. Then it would be highly more accurate. But you're leaving out the right brain hemisphere. You're leaving out the feminine component to the consciousness. You're leaving out the right brain qualities. You're leaving out creativity. You're leaving out compassion. You're leaving out nurturing. You're leaving out intuition. You're leaving out common sense. You're leaving out morality. Okay? So that's where the word generare, to create, comes from, the creative side of the mind. That's why you have to put that together with the intellect to create intelligence. Intella is intellect and gens is creativity. That's why it's called intelligence, ladies and gentlemen. It's right there in the word. So we'll pick this up and move forward with a discussion about genetics versus epigenetics when we come back after this quick break. We'll be right back. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. Into the second hour of tonight's broadcast. We'll take some calls after I wrap up with a couple more slides. I don't have too many more slides, but I just want to breach the next topic, which is genetics versus epigenetics. And this ties hand in hand with evolution versus involution. And there's a reason I'm bringing this up, and hopefully in future weeks this will make a whole lot of sense why I did this at this time. I know people are really hungry to hear more information on human interaction with non-human intelligence, and I am going to get very deeply into that on future shows. This topic, however, is going to play essentially into that information and knowledge, okay? Because what I'm really going to be talking about and postulating and looking at evidence for by many researchers who have uncovered evidence throughout time, by ancient scriptural texts that have been left down, meticulously preserved and handed down from generation to generation by our ancestors to tell us stories about what happened in our ancient past. I'm going to be telling a overall enactment, okay, a general series of events that happened in the ancient past dealing with the hijacking of our species, dealing with the genetic modification of our species, dealing with the willful and deliberate interjection in the natural evolutionary course of development that our species was undergoing, and then derailing it from that evolutionary progression by other intelligent beings that are not human. And again, there's a lot of ancient accounts that discuss this. And there's a lot of evidence for it in the ancient world and in the modern world as well. The problem is people have a particular worldview that they're attached to. And therefore, they don't want to look at the evidence. They don't want to look at any evidence. They want to say, I have a religion and this told me all about where we came from. And therefore, evidence be damned. Or they want to say, I follow science. I'm a worshiper at the altar of scientism. The priests in the white lab coats didn't tell me anything about that. I never heard anything about that from my anthropology professor. And you're not going to either. Because they're paradigm protectors. They're people out there trying to protect a paradigm. All religionists are. Every religion wants to protect its paradigm. They're not interested in truth. Truth is the last thing anybody who's an adherent of religion wants. They don't want truth. They want reinforcement for their religion. They don't want to look at where the evidence leads. They don't want to adjust their worldview accordingly based on new evidence being brought to light. They just want to say, this is what I believe, because this is what makes me comfortable. This is what I'm most comfortable hearing. Even if the truth is highly disturbing, the people who really are seeking truth will go there. And they will take it in. And they won't accept it blindly. They'll look at the evidence. They'll filter it. They'll decide, does that make sense? Does that fit? Or is that contradictive? And does it not fit? That's what the process of truth discovery is all about. It's about going where the evidence leads, looking at what's actually there, not just believing in something. And unfortunately, modern science has become just another religion. That's why I call it scientism and not real science. Because these people are just protecting a worldview. They're not going where evidence leads. They're not looking at what's there. Often what happens in anthropology and archaeology, if actual real-world physical evidence contradicts the long-standing stories of these traditions, you know what happens to it? It gets buried. Not literally buried back in the ground, but it gets buried in a basement in some university, museum, or some historical museum somewhere. Never to be seen again, Put in a box marked as an anomaly. A couple of researchers had ever had their eyes on it. This doesn't fit in with our paradigm. We have no mechanism for explaining this anomaly, and therefore can't show that to the public. No way. The public gets different ideas about the story that actually happened here in the world, in our world, that we say happened in the ancient past. There goes my tenure. Can't have that. My paycheck would dry up. I might have only one Lexus in the garage instead of 3. How dare we go where the truth leads, where the evidence leads? Not possible. This is the ego that currently controls science, ladies and gentlemen. They're not conducting real science. Never have been. Never have been. It's a religion just like any other. This calls to mind this whole argument between, when it comes to evolution, okay, is it macrobiological Darwinian evolution or is it creation? Did God just make it all happen? Never thinking that there's some third position or a fourth or a fifth or a sixth. It's just these two dichotomies, these polarities warring with each other that do nothing but ultimately create more strength from the paradigm protectors, just to keep more and more people off the path of truth. That's all it's really about. That's all protecting these two paradigms of Darwinian macrobiological evolution versus, God did it all, suddenly, spontaneous creation. We don't want to think that evolution could just be a continuous force beginning from, time immemorial, forever, forget having no beginning, forget a beginning, and just progressing continuously and simultaneously working against it is a counterforce, a counterbalancing force that occultists have termed involution. And what it's all about is consciousness, and consciousness can have ebbs and flows. Consciousness can have peaks and valleys to its wave of propagation. We can become more conscious at one time and then less conscious at another, depending on what happens, depending on what ideas were propagated, depending on what may have happened to us in relationship to other species, depending on what natural events may have occurred on the planet that we happen to be living on. All of these factors play into things. We don't want to look at it holistically like that. We want to say real simple, oh no, it's just a mechanized force or God did it all. See how childish and unidimensional that is? I personally think it is, but, a lot of people are just rigidly attached to their belief systems. And that's all I'm here to do. I'm trying to put something out there to get people to see something in a little bit different of a perspective. And maybe that perspective might make a whole lot more sense than anything that they've been clinging to and believing in all these years. Maybe it just might. Let's go right to the phones in this segment. Let's hear from Dylan in Washington. Dylan, you're live on What on Earth is Happening. What do you have for us here tonight?
Well, I got two things, and your evolution-involution slide here popped something into my head. I majored in chemistry in college.
Yes.
And I wouldn't necessarily call myself a chemist because I believe I got taught a bunch of crap. But you mentioned that modern science seems to have both this entropic and syntropic concepts, and it seems to fall out of the way when we get into this Darwinian evolution thing. And I just remember in my science classes there was this huge push, and I didn't take a lot of physics because this is more in physics than it is in chemistry.
Right.
That there's only entropy.
Yes.
Everything is getting more and more disordered, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the fact that we're all alive is totally incomprehensible.
Yeah, and nothing could be further from the truth, because there certainly is an ordering force within creation. It's called consciousness. It's called will. It's called true care. You know, it involves everything that we are capable of if we put those gifts to use. If we put those gifts of creation to use, we can become a syntropic force within creation through our consciousness.
Definitely, and I just wanted to point out that this Darwinian, like, mechanistic degradation to rubble, right, really seems to persist in the other sciences as well. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, I agree, and that's a really great point. They're only teaching one side of this and saying that's all that exists. And this other force isn't even out there. That's why it took so long for scientists to even name this force, to postulate and name it, the ordering force. And it's been called syntropy or extropy. Some other scientists refer to it as extropy. I like the force of syntropy, the syntropic force, personally. But I just call it the ordering force. That's all. It's the force that has intelligence as its underlying ordering principle. That's how I look at it. Mm-hmm. So, really great point. Did you want to say anything else?
Yes. Sure. The second thing I wanted to bring up was, you haven't gotten too far into epigenetics yet. Right. But maybe if you don't want to answer this quite yet and do it a little bit later.
No, it's okay. Go right ahead.
Like, personal looking at yourself and dealing with yourself epigenetics, what are, like, specific techniques for getting over, like, your own body prison? Because, I mean, these beliefs put yourself in the prison of your own body.
Sure, because they'll curtail certain behaviors, they'll curtail actions that you could be taking. If you hold a certain belief, that's going to ultimately affect your behavior. And, that could have to do with diet, that could have to do with exercise, that could have to do with activism, it could have to do with a whole range of things going on in your life. And it could hold you back from doing so much. Techniques, of course, employing all of the three modes of thought, both concentration, meditation, and contemplation simultaneously. I mean, not at the same time, but using them all in your life to create balance, to create holistic balance in the brain hemispheres, engaging in scientific thought, reading about science, studying, all kinds of different scientific disciplines. Also then getting into studying natural law, studying about morality, really understanding that difference, looking into consciousness, looking into emotional qualities. You name the field of endeavor, but it has to be balanced. That has to be a balanced approach. So my real answer to that question is anything that is conducive to balance. You want to become a generalist. You want to, but you also want to be able to develop laser-like focus too. Okay? You want to engage the right brain hemispherical modalities of compassion, intuition, creativity. Art can help do that. Music can help do that. But you also want to, be versed in mathematics and be versed in other physical sciences, to ground yourself. And that's left brain thought. So anything that promotes holistic thought processes is one of the things that can really help us to get over anything happening in the bodily sense or in the gene code sense. I would also say there's other specific techniques like EFT, acupuncture and acupressure. I mean, there's things dealing with actual energy work in the body too that you can do. I don't specifically specialize in those, but I know a bit about them. And one of the things I am going to do when it comes to this is just explain to people how the mechanism of epigenetics works and put people onto a specific researcher that I think, his name is Dr. Bruce Lipton, and I think through studying his work, specifically Wisdom of Your Cells and Biology of Belief, people can really understand how we are not slaves to our genetic code. And the reason I'm bringing this up at the beginning of what I'm going to be getting into is because the material I will be getting into is so heavy and dense, okay, that I don't want to tell that information to people without preparing a framework to say, we're not bound by this. This is something we can ultimately get past and progress past, even though it's this bad. I'm not here to fearmonger people. I'm not here to paint a picture that it's completely hopeless, okay? I'm not also trying to, blow smoke up somebody's rear end and tell them it's all just going to magically work itself out either. I'm trying to present a balanced perspective to understand, yes, has something been done to us probably at a genetic level that is going to be very difficult to overcome? Yes, but can it ultimately be overcome if we employ our knowledge and willpower and our care to it? Absolutely, yes, it can be overcome. Nothing is beyond our reach when we step into the truth and we employ our consciousness to better ourselves. We can progress even beyond that which has already been done to humanity, and quite a bit of negativity has been done to us, as many people are aware. When I get into some of this heavy, dark material regarding non-human intelligence, some people are not going to want to accept it. Some people are going to say that's too horrific to even contemplate how bad the situation really then must be. But I'm not telling people that to completely shut them down. And that's what some people will try to accuse people who do that of. Oh, they're somehow agents. They're trying to tell us this is all beyond hope and it's other beings that just did this to us, so what chance do we have? No, I'm trying to from the very beginning tell you, even if it is that bad, even if that is the situation, it is still overcomable. We still can transcend it because there is a mechanism within us that goes way beyond physicality, that goes beyond just physical genes, and that is the force of consciousness.
Word.
Really, the forces that we're talking about as have been taught by, again, ancient philosophical traditions, ancient wisdom traditions. What we really have to see these two forces on this slide as, evolution and involution, I'm speaking of, are the one force that helps us to move forward, and then the other force is simply what holds us back and is working against our unfolding, okay, and against our expanding, all right? It's that which shuts us down, this involutionary force. So let's look at some of the differences between these two forces and how they work against each other. The evolutionary force, again, is the force of forward progression and creation within the universe. It is that which is moving things according to the will of creation. Okay? It is moving things in an orderly progression forward, in betterment, in greater levels of order and complexity. Conversely, the involutionary force is that which is working to create stagnation. It is a degenerating force. It breaks things down. It doesn't order things, it breaks them down, okay? And it separates and it divides. The evolutionary force is syntropic. Now, many people will never have heard that term. It is the opposite of entropy. Syntropy is what scientists have postulated as meaning the ordering force in creation. It is that which is the opposite of entropy. Some scientists refer to this as negative entropy because they didn't have a real opposite for entropy. And entropy, again, is the chaotic force. I also wanted to mention that there is a support donation button on the left-hand side of the whatonearthishappening.com website. If you feel you've gained find value from the information I have shared throughout the course of this radio show, feel free to make a voluntary donation by clicking that button on the left-hand side of the website. So I want to direct everyone's attention to the WhatOnEarthIsHappening.com radio show page, where, as always, during the live broadcasts, I put underneath the player on the radio show page, that's the radio show tab of the website, images for tonight's show. They are listed as numerical links, and if you click on them, it brings up a small slideshow that you could follow along with the slides that I've prepared for the concepts and ideas I'll be discussing on tonight's show. So the main topic for tonight is going to be, how does scientism see the process of evolutionary development, versus how have many different mystery traditions and mystery schools over time seen this same process, and how do these things compare and how do they contrast? How are they alike, and how are these concepts, as discussed by these two schools of thought, drastically different from each other? So on the radio show page and with the podcast, and again, this will be podcast number 152, image number 1 was simply the poster, the flyer for my Streetwise Spirituality lecture in seminar in St. Louis. That's there. You could feel free to share that on any website or social media, or print it up for whoever you might know who might be able to attend. Image number 2 is this very simple chart that I have built regarding two forces that are at work in our lives at all times and places. These are the two forces that are essentially at work in the universe, all around us at all times. One is the force that moves us forward. One is the force that holds us back. We'll pick that up on the other side of the break. We'll be right back. The topic for tonight's show is how the ancient mystery schools saw the force of evolution, and how their worldview regarding this force was different than the way scientism sees the evolutionary force at work in the world, specifically through the theories of Charles Darwin, and how that's been applied in our modern world, particularly through what is known as social Darwinism. So, slide number 2, I made a very simple chart, or just a graph of these two forces and what they involve. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that in the green coloring, I've put the force of evolution there, and directed arrows moving from left to right, the same direction that we, write text in here in the Western world. And, that's supposed to represent that it's moving forward. It's moving from something that is lesser to something that is greater. It's moving from some place that is less advanced to a place that's more. Biological organisms propagate themselves into the future and preserve their genes and advance their genes. And while I would say that I tend to agree with some of the concepts contained in Darwinistic theory, like adaptation, natural selection, things like that, I don't subscribe to macrobiological Darwinian evolutionary theory that propagates the notion that a species becomes a completely different species, and then there's a bunch of transitional fossil species in the fossil record. The reason I don't subscribe to that is because the main thing that would espouse and support that theory would be evidence in the fossil record. There would be many transitional species found in the fossil record for all kinds of species, and the evidence just doesn't support that claim, especially for human beings, most of all for human beings. There is not one bone in the so-called hominid ancestors of humanity that is present in any human skeleton that has ever been uncovered on the face of the earth. Okay? So there's many more reasons why I feel it doesn't hold as much water as people think that it does, and put as much faith in it as other people do, which we will get into in the future. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because The topics that I'm going to go into in the future on this show, coming in future weeks, are going to be very dependent on a view of evolution. It is going to be about what is better, what is worse, what really propagates progress, what really holds back progress. These are advanced, and it's moving in a forward progression. So that's really what evolution is all about. It's about forward movement. The word itself comes from the term to unfurl or to unfold. To roll out is literally what the word means. It means to roll out. Okay? So evolution is an expansive force in creation. And, just as a brief aside, I just want to say I'm covering this topic because it seems that the universe wants me to really talk about this because of synchronicities that have happened to me in my life over the past several weeks. Everything keeps coming back to people's view of what real evolution is in my life when I'm speaking to people. And it seems that one of the major things that is holding back people's worldview in life and holding them in a state of mind control and unconsciousness is their completely erroneous notion of what evolution is based on their religious acceptance of the Darwinian theory of evolution. Proposed and propagated by scientism. And when you see how absolutely rigidly they are attached to this belief system, and it is only a belief system because it is only a theory and has never been 100% factually proven scientifically. As I said last week on the show, macrobiological Darwinian theory has never been borne out in the fossil record. It is still only a theoretical approach to how